So do I want to say something? Do you want me to say something about today's agenda? It's switched off. No, it's switched off. No. That's okay. I get it. final order is Rachel, Dolly, Nayana, and Rachel. This is the order we are going to go.
Listen to me for 40 minutes straight.
Dolly, then you.
That was Priyanthi's very good point.
Yes.
I need a pen.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning and welcome to the last day of this symposium and also to the last plenary panel, which is on livelihoods and social protection. In this panel, we will have 4 papers from 3 presenters. This is because Teddy Atim from Uganda actually couldn't make it. She was a victim of the rigidity of the immigration system. So she's not here with us today. But Rachel Gordon has very bravely agreed to present Teddy's paper on Uganda as well as her own on South Sudan. So thank you very much, Rachel. And so we will have 4 papers. But before I go into that, let me just tell you a little bit about what's going to happen for the rest of today while people keep coming in. After this panel, which we will finish at about 11 or 11:15 in the tea break, we will break up again into smaller workshops. In this hall, where there will be simultaneous translation, there is a forum on fishing. In lecture hall 2, which is down the corridor, there's one on entrepreneurship. And in the conference hall upstairs, conference hall 3 upstairs, there is a forum on access to health, water, and sanitation. And then we will have lunch, followed by what is, I think, a rather slightly different formulation of the sessions, which is we are having looking back to look ahead. So certain what has been called provocation reflection. So we have 3 colleagues actually who have followed most of the symposium, looking back at what has happened, pulling out the issues and reflecting on them. And then we have a valedictory panel, which is really actually bringing all of this discussion home to Sri Lanka, because this is where we are, and having some key decision makers in the Sri Lankan polity actually talking about post-war Sri Lanka. And after that, we welcome you to some refreshments as we close the whole event. So I hope today is going to be as exciting as the previous 2 days have been. I will introduce our speakers first. Rachel Gordon, who's going to do the double act, is a researcher and program manager with the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium in South Sudan and Uganda programs, the 2 programs. She's based at the Feinstein International Center at Tufts University in Boston. She also co-leads the SLRC's gender mainstreaming strategy. So prior to working with SLRC, she has dual master's degrees in urban planning and international affairs, and has been actively involved with a number of international social justice organizations. Nayana Godamunne, who's on my right, is a senior researcher from CEPA. Nayana holds a master's in forced migration from the Department of International Development, Queen Elizabeth House, University of Oxford. At CEPA, she has worked on issues of post-war reconciliation, development, induced displacement and diaspora engagement, and co-leads the vulnerability and poverty thematic, and is currently engaged in long-term research program which explores the links between state legitimacy and social protection in a post-war context. And this is, I think, something will be part of the subject of her paper. But she also continues to be engaged with her interests in aspects of forced migration. And our third speaker, Dolly Kikon, who's been making a very strong contribution to the discussions up to now. We will get the opportunity to hear her speak. She's a postdoctoral fellow, Department of Social Anthropology at the Stockholm University, and her dissertation, which was titled Disturbed Area Acts, Intimacy, Anxiety, and State in the North, examined the modern state and development programs. And I think in this, in a paper today, which also has a very interesting title, How to Make Pickle During Ceasefire, we will hear some of her ideas about that. Her work is based on field work and in Northeast India. As we know, this session is called Livelihoods and Social Protection. And as we know, secure livelihoods are central to the well-being of everyone. They're important for rebuilding economies of households. They are also important to revitalizing local economies. And given the kind of multiple vulnerabilities and risks that people face in post-war societies, the issue of social protection is also important. And I think what these papers will highlight is how the delivery of services to secure livelihoods and deliver social protection intersect with a range of other issues like gender, caste, ethnicity, and class, as well as sort of exposure to displacement and violence, inter and intra-community relations, how gaps in expectation and legitimacy affect the provision of access to social protection or livelihoods, particularly given the sort of political fragility or political fraught nature of post-war contexts. I'm hoping too that in these presentations, we will be able to bring into this room more strongly the voices of the people affected by war. I think up to now we've been talking very much in a very conceptual space, and I think we hope that in this plenary we'll be able to bring some of the more people-oriented issues also onto the table. So with that, I will now ask Rachel to make her presentation, or at least hers and Teddy's presentation, Surveying Livelihood, Service Delivery and Governance, Baseline Evidence from Uganda. Okay, 15 to 20 minutes.
Can you move this, or is that? Good morning. Can everyone hear me okay? Great. Let me know if that ceases to be the case. I want to begin, as everyone has begun, by thanking CEPA and all of the hard work that's gone into organizing this really excellent symposium. Also, as Priyanthi said, I'm here to present on the South Sudan material, but also because Teddy Atim was unable to come at the last minute. I'll be, unfortunately for you, trying to give her presentation on Uganda as well. I am familiar with that data also, but she does give a better presentation on it than I do. It should be lost on none of us that I am a white American woman, educated, my native language is English. This is a very privileged position that I come from to try to represent the views of people in South Sudan and Uganda. And it's not ideal, but it is what you have this morning, so I'll begin with Uganda. As has been mentioned, the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium is a 6-year, 8-country study examining livelihoods and access to services in conflict-affected and post-conflict states. In Uganda, our work is led by the Feinstein International Center at Tufts in Boston in the US, where I work, and we're partnered with researchers at ODI in London, as well as a couple of Ugandan NGOs, the African Youth Initiative Network and the Women's Rural Development Network. In early 2013, we carried out a sub-regional panel survey across 2 sub-regions in northern Uganda. We interviewed 1,877 households in total over a period of about 3 weeks. And we'll go back to those same households early next year to administer the same survey. Also, throughout 2012 to 2016, we're supplementing that survey work with a lot of in-depth qualitative work on a number of related themes. So essentially what we hope to capture and understand here in all of this research is people's livelihoods. So what are their income-generating activities, their asset portfolios, crimes and shocks that they're experiencing, what's their food security situation, constraining and enabling factors that they're dealing with, and what are their strategies and outcomes. What is their access to basic services, education, health, water, also social protection and livelihoods assistance? What are people's perceptions of and relationships with governance processes and practices? So participation in public meetings, experience with grievance mechanisms, perceptions of major political actors, priorities and policies. And finally, and this is unique to Uganda, what is their experience of serious crimes during the war and the impacts of those experiences on all of the above? Now, to give you a brief overview of the situation in northern Uganda, many of you have probably heard of the war in northern Uganda that took place between the government and Joseph Kony and his Lord's Resistance Army between 1986 and 2007. During wartime, over 90% of the population of Acholi subregion and 33% of the population of Lango subregion, those are the two subregions we're working in, were displaced from their homes. Many of them went to internally displaced persons camps that were run by the government of Uganda. This was theoretically for their protection, although in reality the situation in the camps was actually perhaps more dangerous than their situation at home. At one point in 2004, people were dying in the camps at a rate of approximately 1,000 per week for a variety of reasons. In the mid-2000s, the government of Uganda decided to pursue an outright military solution to the conflict, and so the peace processes that had been happening up to that point then collapsed. In 2005, Joseph Kony was indicted by the International Criminal Court on a number of war crimes and crimes against humanity charges. And in 2007, the LRA actually retreated into neighboring countries where it's been causing a lot of trouble and displacement, including in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan, actually. But this did leave northern Ugandans in relative peace for the first time in about 20 years, and they were able to really return in large numbers to their homes. And for many of them, this was the first peace that they had known in their lifetimes. Now, fast forward to 2014, Uganda today is the youngest country in the world. 78% of the population is under 30 years of age. It has the highest youth unemployment in sub-Saharan Africa, and 73% of the prison population is under the age of 25. So there's really this incredibly large youth bubble coming up in Uganda today. It's also one of the poorest countries in the world. It ranks 161st out of 187 countries on the Human Development Index. And northern Uganda specifically rates at 87% on the Multidimensional Poverty Index, which is a more holistic way of measuring poverty. So this is actually worse than Somalia. Northern Uganda, 87%, compares to Somalia at 81% on the Multidimensional Poverty Index. 1/4 of households in the country live in poverty, and in the north of Uganda, that increases to 1/2 living in poverty. Now, all of this is true in spite of the fact that Uganda received $1.65 billion US dollars in official development assistance in 2012 alone. That's the most recent year for which we have figures. So our study in northern Uganda looks at Acholi and Lango subregions, as I mentioned, which are the two most affected by the war. And our survey was statistically representative of those two subregions, as well as all of the villages in which it took place. So it actually represents 3.63 million people in the north, and is the first survey to represent this whole population. I'll just run through a few of the highlights of our findings. What we found is that people who are doing the best in terms of livelihoods are those whose primary income comes from a couple of different sources. They own their own livestock, they own a business, or they're employed by the government. And this is not many people. This is about 8% of the population in total. 81% of the population in northern Uganda is living off their own subsistence agriculture, their own cultivation. And in terms of livelihoods, those are the people who are doing the worst. They have the fewest assets, they have the worst food security, and the least wealth. This was true for both male and female-headed households across the spectrum, although we did find that most female-headed households we talked to were trying to live off their own cultivation. Not surprisingly, the more education people have, the better off they are. Although women heading their own households tended to need even more education than male-headed households to be at the same level. Women need to have completed A levels, whereas male household heads only needed to have completed O levels to really show that significant improvement. I don't know how that corresponds to the education system in Sri Lanka, A levels and O levels, better probably than it does to the education system in the United States, but of course, the majority of people, and household heads included, in northern Uganda have not completed even primary school. And those are the households that have consistently the worst outcomes. Now, one of the most interesting things that we found in our survey is that people are recovering far more slowly than is often thought from the war. We have enough distance now from the war and displacement in northern Uganda, and enough people have actually returned back to their original homes so that we can start to measure how recovery is really going for them. And it's not going quickly. What we found is that it actually takes 10 years for people to really restart to rebuild their assets and wealth. And for female-headed households, it takes even more than 10 years for them to see any improvement after the war. Now, what we would hope, and what has been mandated by various aid and government policies in northern Uganda, is that there would be increased livelihoods and social protection assistance for those households to aid in their recovery. Unfortunately, this doesn't appear to be the case. Only 16% of the households that we interviewed had received any livelihoods assistance in the past 3 years, and over half of that was a one-time distribution of seeds, which is generally the least meaningful kind of assistance. Over half of the households who did receive assistance reported that it had no impact, so really people aren't seeing any support from that. We also found something kind of interesting, a little bit funny going on with who is receiving assistance. The people receiving it are households with better food security, more wealth, even when controlling for district differences in other ways. It's male-headed households who are receiving assistance. Most households who received money, a cash grant of some kind, were those who own their own shop or market stall. And households with a member working in the private sector or an NGO made up the highest percentage of households who were receiving non-agricultural services. Now, there are two possible explanations for these results. Either the transfers have had a really positive impact on household food access and wealth, or the targeting of the transfers has been skewed, whether accidentally or deliberately, away from the households who are most in need and most vulnerable, and towards the households who are already better off. And we believe it's the latter that's happening. We believe there's a policy focus on the more so-called viable households that concentrates aid to them because they're already doing better and it's easier to show an improvement in their livelihoods, and it's much harder to figure out how to support the most vulnerable households. The same was true with social protection. We found that only 4% of households report receiving anything, so that would be free food, household items, school feeding programs, old age pensions, et cetera. And even of those 4%, half were just a one-time event. Now, just to be clear, between 2002 and 2012, again, the government of Uganda received a tremendous amount of aid and, in fact, $560 million for humanitarian assistance to LRA-affected areas. And yet we see almost none of that aid having gone to households. Now, another piece of our survey, which, as I mentioned, is rather unique to the Uganda survey in terms of SLRC, is that we looked specifically at serious crimes and human rights violations that were experienced by household members during the war and the continuing effects of those experiences on the household today. So serious crimes, I won't go through the whole list because it's really long and really depressing, but that includes things like destruction of property, abduction, forced recruitment, forced disappearance, surviving a massacre, sexual abuse, returning from the war with a child born of rape, being forced to kill. There are a number of other ones. This is all out of international humanitarian law. Now, these crimes, we recorded them in our survey if they were perpetrated by parties to the conflict. So that includes the LRA, government forces, militias, and also Karamojong raiders from Karamoja, which is the neighboring subregion. And we found that 55% of households in Acholi had experienced these crimes, had at least one member who had experienced such crimes, and 28% of households in Lango had experienced one or more. 14% of households across the two regions had a household member who was violently killed during the war, and 13% had members who were forcibly disappeared and never returned. So we're talking about an enormous part of the population that's had these experiences and is still feeling an impact from them today. And what we wanted to know is what those impacts are. What we found is that they're really quite significant. So if anyone in the household experienced a serious crime, other than destruction of property, for a reason I'll say in a second, it is correlated pretty strongly with them being war wounded, so having a physical or emotional wound ongoing. They have less food access, they have less wealth and fewer assets, they have worse access to healthcare, worse access to education, worse access to water, they're more dissatisfied with the services that they receive. And they also have the most negative views of both local and central government. Now, the reason that we don't include destruction of property is that we wanted to focus only on those crimes that were really related to people's physical bodily experience, because we want to show the strength of the data in terms of bodily and emotional harm that people are still experiencing. So we also found that experiencing serious crimes has a compounding effect. So the more crimes that people experience, that people in the household experience, the worse off the household. So not only do those crimes have a significant impact, but the more of them that happened to the household, the worse things are today. And we found that those households don't receive any more livelihoods assistance or social protection assistance than other households. And when they do receive assistance, they are less likely to say that it had an impact. So any aid that is going to them is actually less helpful. Now, going deeper, we looked at a couple of different smaller populations. One is the war-wounded population, those who report having an ongoing physical or emotional injury. And that is fully 10% of the population across these two subregions. 5% said they have injuries that continue to impair their functionality today, and more than half of those are mental and emotional impacts and injuries. So this comes to about 181,000 people, if we extrapolate out from our survey, who have impaired functionality because of war wounds that they sustained up to 2007, which is a little bit ago now. And about 1/4 of that population, the war-wounded population, has received some treatment, although what our qualitative work has revealed is a pretty complex picture of treatment. Not everyone said that they needed treatment, but of those who did and said that they were receiving it, about half, actually more than half, were just receiving like pain medication. So they weren't receiving any sort of therapeutic response whatsoever, just trying to manage their pain. And of course, we're not medical staff, so we can't diagnose the accuracy of that, but our numbers correlate to a study that was done a couple years ago in northern Uganda, in which clinical medical officers were also the surveyors. So they were able to diagnose, and they turned up similar numbers. So from that study and our follow-up work, it's pretty easy to make a really conservative estimate that somewhere between 51,000 and 77,000 people in northern Uganda currently need treatment for war injuries that impair their functionality. And not surprisingly, those households, as I mentioned, are worse off. They're poorer, they own less livestock, they have less diversified livelihoods portfolios, less wealth, et cetera. So the same is also true for households where a member experienced sexual violence, which was reported to be about 1 in 50 households in Laung and 2 in 50 households in Acholi. Except, of course, we believe that the numbers are much, much higher, but it's very difficult to capture, particularly data about sexual violence in surveys like this, because people are very unwilling to talk about it. But if we just take our numbers at face value, we can extrapolate that there are, for example, about somewhere between 3,000 to 8,000 households in northern Uganda in which there is a child who was born of rape that happened during the war. And the most important part of our data is the link that we found between surviving sexual violence during the war and being vulnerable and experiencing more crimes today. So we don't actually know of another study that shows this link the way that we do, and it shows a big disconnect in programming aimed at people who are experiencing or have experienced sexual and gender-based violence, because that's generally targeting intimate partner violence. And what we found is that the whole household in these situations is facing a range of crimes and insecurity now that even other households who experienced serious crimes during the war are not facing. So just to pull this all together a little bit, if we're asking how aid for state building and access to services is doing at pulling people out of poverty in a post-conflict context, the answer in northern Uganda is that it's not doing very well. Livelihood support is either not available or it's not helpful. Necessary education is not available. Targeting of support is skewed. People continue to be unable to function or to be highly insecure because of their experiences during the war. And those with the most need and the greatest vulnerability remain the worse off, even though they actually have a right under international law for remedy and reparation for the crimes that they experienced during the war. They need specialized medical care and services, which have not been prioritized by donors or the government. They also need security and protection from crimes that they're experiencing today. And this brings us back to what Dr. Sidika said on the first day, that post-conflict really doesn't necessarily mean peace for these communities. And I'll certainly be talking more about that when I get to South Sudan a little bit later in this panel. But generally, we believe that it's long past time to really rethink the post-conflict aid and government policies and actions in northern Uganda. And we hope that particularly by adding this focus on serious crimes in our survey, that this can be a model that could be used elsewhere to create those generate the data, create those connections, and generate the critical questions that we need to be asking in these post-conflict environments. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Dolly. We've come from areas that we don't know that well, Acholi and Lango in northern Uganda, and now I think Dolly's going to talk us through some work she's done in northeast India, which again I think is an area that most of us are not that familiar with. So, Dolly.
Thank you so much for having me here, CEPA and SLRC. It's a privilege and it's very humbling to be part of this conversation. I just want to say that the discussion that I want to share with you today is actually a leftover of my long-term research that I did in Northeast India, which is a very militarized conflict zone. And I think that also shows the limitations and shortcomings of research and what goes into research and how much there is out there that just gets left out. So when Vijay and CEPA friends invited me to Sri Lanka, I thought that this is a data that I really cherished and I wanted to come by and share this with you. As you can see, the title of my presentation is How to Make Pickles During a Ceasefire, Discussions on Livelihood and Development in Northeast India. And I'm specifically going to talk about Nagaland and the Naga experience. So I'll just read out my paper. Northeast India has witnessed armed conflicts since India's independence in 1947. Beginning in the late 1990s and 2000s, numerous insurgent groups and the government of India signed multiple ceasefire agreements. Since then, there has been an increasing interest among policymakers and business groups to determine the potentials and drawbacks of Northeast India. Such expressions to promote development has also found its way in India's 5-year plans in the last decade or so. The section on spatial development and regional imbalance in the 11th 5-year plan, Volume 1, devotes a sizable segment to Northeast India and describes that development has been slow in the region, but stops short of explaining the reasons why that has been the case. The document further details and defines all the states in Northeast India as special category states, which require special attention in areas of governance as well as social and economic sectors. There is a large literature and even larger political positions that are critical of development and livelihood programs today. Of course, most of these grand projects have been detrimental and seldom benefit the poor and the marginalized in many parts of the world. Having said so, denouncing these activities, I believe, is not good enough because we must try to engage and connect the paradoxical links they offer. First, Development projects are packaged as economic interventions to improve the lives of people, but are often detached from the militarized reality. And second, initiatives to rebuild militarized societies overlook how violence has transformed the very foundation of these societies, from the metaphysical level of ethics, moralities, solidarities, to the everyday realities like the composition of the family unit, gender relations, and most importantly, the relationship between the citizens and the state that even Rachel was telling us about in their data. New forms of social relations have emerged in these societies, and it is important to observe that. Militarization, as we know, is a system where the functions and structures of society are predominantly governed along the lines of militaristic principles and ideology. Militarized places conjure an image of a society that is contrary to the ideals and guarantees assumed to exist in normal societies. For instance, in Northeast India, there are extra-constitutional regulations like the Armed Forces Special Power Act, under which a high number of human rights violations, deaths and killings, and violence against women and children have been committed for several decades since India's independence. Such distressing accounts often present people living in militarized societies as helpless and powerless. Today, however, the quest to promote development and growth in these places have produced novel ways to implement development programs and livelihood initiatives on the ground. These activities are carried out in order to rebuild societies that have experienced war, or as official documents in India announce, to nurture peace and harmony. In Nagaland, after Naga insurgents and the government of India entered into a ceasefire agreement in 1997, villages were relocated from interrogation rooms to microfinance classes, and farmers previously restricted indoors due to curfews and the war were summoned to attend awareness classes and grow cash crops. As I have noted previously, it is not enough to denounce these current activities because they not only aim at improving the lives of people ravaged by war and conflict, but also offer them a possibility of rebuilding their lives and developing their societies, however problematic the circumstances might be. Thus, I begin by inquiring what kind of imaginations about development do such visions inspire? Can these societies be considered as beneficiaries of the developmental regime entering post-conflict militarized societies? Such inquiries and insights, I believe, leads us to explore how governments and organizations ranging from the local, regional to international bodies working to implement development programs approach societies ravaged by conflict and war. Do these institutions take into consideration pre-existing conditions of inclusions and exclusions? In what ways do they negotiate the new power relations and developmental brokers and dealers that have emerged in these societies? And finally, what are the emerging realities of the social world where infrastructural interventions and economic developments are taking place? Let me address these questions this morning by presenting the case of Nagaland. In the last decade or so, ecological sustainability has become a global theme for agriculture food production. They have appeared in Nagaland as well. After Naga insurgents and the government of India entered into a ceasefire in 1997, a number of national and international organizations have started working with the state government to promote livelihood programs and assist cultivation in Nagaland. Funded by the Global Environment Facility, the GEF, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, in partnership with the government of Nagaland, launched a program in 2009 titled Subsistence Land and Ecosystem Management in Shifting Cultivation Areas of Nagaland for Ecological and Livelihood Security, unquote. It's a long theme. The UNDP project is focused on 3 districts in Nagaland to address issues such as ecosystem and biodiversity, sustainable development, climate change, and land degradation. The GEF-funded UNDP project has organized workshops and programs about sustainable agriculture, ecological management, and building institutional support for cultivators across rural Nagaland since 2009. Some time ago, I attended one such workshop which was focused on food preservation. And this is a story I would like to share with you this morning. That particular morning, the training team carrying out the UNDP project in a village consisted of 2 employees with master's degree in social science and 1 officer from the Department of Agriculture. However, with the exception of the trainers, none of the participants were in sight. We had to wind up early due to poor attendance, the trainers and the officer told me. I inquired whether the cultivators were properly informed and aware of the workshop. The officer responded to my query in the following manner. Cultivators cannot even spend 30 minutes now. They are out in the field. You see, it's a time-bound activity. They have to tend to the vegetables and produce. Some of them are ready for picking now, and others need attention, unquote. The UNDP development projects and the cultivators were operating with different deadlines. While officers and trainers on the field followed the project timeline, the cultivators had to keep up with the agricultural cycle. Villages and districts were chosen for the UNDP program on the basis of the intensity of jhum cultivation in those areas. The objective was to control and minimize its adverse impact on the environment. However, the field officials said that the responses to the UNDP-led project in other villages had also been unsatisfactory. This is the first UNDP collaboration with the department, the official said with some enthusiasm. He began to explain the project, but stopped abruptly and handed me a pamphlet instead. Everything is written there. The translation is on the back, but it's not a good one. I carry my own when I conduct a workshop, he said. The training brochure laid out the program for the workshop. The cultivators were expected to interact with their trainers during the Q&A session. There were already laid out questions that the cultivators were required to ask them. But the lack of interest and the low numbers of participants reduced the program to an official exercise. When I asked him again whether he followed the steps for preserving food as promoted by the UNDP, he paused and smiled. My wife will not allow it, the official told me. Then he went to describe how his house preserved food. He said, we have a layman technology to preserve chilies and other vegetables, and explained the technique for preserving green chilies. He told me, we wash the green chili and pour bamboo shoot juice over the chili. We preserve vegetables for 7 to 8 months with this technology. That's the same process with tomatoes, with brinjals, and with all other vegetables. And he gave me a whole list of it. One of the trainers, named Tiala, with a degree in home science, described how households in Nagaland followed indigenous methods to preserve food, but emphasized that the objective of the UNDP program was to introduce the cultivators and households to a new technology. This new technology, I learned, was a pickle-making technique with 2 ingredients, mustard oil and vinegar. She explained the new technology by comparing the lives of cultivators in Nagaland with residents from other parts of India. She gave the example of Gujarat in Western India, where she had earned her university degree. She said, in Gujarat, it's different. Villages are more advanced. The measurement for development and progress was not the existing knowledge about food preservation, but whether the knowledge of a society was scientific enough to make the food sufficiently palatable for the market. The UNDP trainer underlined the importance of scientific preservation as follows. I quote, I have seen that most people here in Nagaland process a lot of food, but in this manner, only the Nagas or people from Northeast India will like the taste. In order to market the chili pickle outside the region, we are teaching them another technology, unquote. The scientific method of food preservation was dependent on the marketability of taste. The training, it appeared, was more about training cultivators to acquire new taste and join the market. Gaining entry into the market economy was considered as an important indicator to measure the success or failure of the UNDP development and livelihood program. The discussion became less about food preservation and more about awareness and the illiteracy of the cultivators. Words such as sustainability, ecosystem, entrepreneurs, management, livelihood, and food security were translated through the food preservation program. When I inquired who would eat the mustard and vinegar chili pickles, the officials did not respond to my question, but emphasized, we are focusing on self-help groups. The food sustainability program was ultimately geared towards creating a microcredit system to connect the market and generate income in rural Nagaland. There was a strong gender element to the program. The officials said, "We suggest it is better for women to form these groups since they are more knowledgeable about the produce," unquote. The women self-help groups under the program were given 10,000 rupees, around $200, to start the chili pickle projects. The target was to sell the first batch of pickles from these food workshops at the Northeast Agricultural Expo. He said, UNDP has said if they can make, the women self-help groups can make 300 packets of preserved chili pickle, the self-help groups will be given a UNDP-sponsored stall in the expo with UNDP brands all over. But it depends on the women. And he shifted the responsibility of meeting the deadline on the women. The women folk that the program targeted looked after the household and also took care of the everyday agricultural activities. Many of them tried to make ends meet by selling produce at the weekly markets and doing daily wage laborers around the area. The UNDP and Government of Nagaland program on sustainable ecosystems and livelihood to empower the poor and marginalized resonates with ongoing developments and livelihood initiatives around the world. It appears that there is a worldwide shift in thinking about poverty and social and humanitarian assistance. These programs and initiatives believe that hunger is best dealt with by boosting the purchasing power of those at risk. Here, the Government of Nagaland and UNDP link development and progress, employment, gender empowerment, and entrepreneurship to the market, and not as issues that the states need to address urgently. Let me spend a few minutes in bringing back the state and why I think it is extremely important that we engage with the state here. Philanthropic foundations, non-governmental organizations, and voluntary agencies are playing important roles in rebuilding post-conflict societies. The Gates Foundation, UNDP, Doctors Without Borders, and Amnesty International, among others, have made their presence in Nagaland since the ceasefire in 1997. Ranging from documenting human rights violations to carrying out malaria awareness campaigns, these organizations have at times taken over the role and responsibilities of the state to deliver basic amenities like health and education. While such initiatives have had some real policy implications on the ground, such forms of intervention also absolve the state of accountability towards its most vulnerable and marginalized population. It is in this spirit argued that governance should be rooted in political and social history of the place and not categorized as a time-bound crisis management project. What does it mean to bring back the state in rebuilding post-conflict societies? How can perpetrators rehabilitate its victims? How can we connect chili pickle workshops in rural Nagaland with complex processes such as global sustainability, ecosystems, and biodiversity? It would be a mistake to demand that the Indian government rebuild Naga society as it was in the 1930s and 40s before the conflict started. It would be a blunder to imagine that the governments and humanitarian agencies can undo the damage and trauma Naga people have undergone in violent armed conflict. When I underline the importance of the state in rehabilitating post-conflict societies or state interventions during ceasefire, as is the case in Nagaland currently, I'm calling for ways to begin the process of reconstruction by acknowledging that states have played a fundamental role in legalizing violence and creating a milieu of impunity in these societies. An elderly Naga woman wearing rubber slippers and carrying a bamboo basket on her head smiles at the camera in the backdrop of a forest in rural Nagaland. She is the cover girl of the 2013 annual performance report of UNDP-supported GEF finance projects globally. The frames and methods employed in creating awareness workshops, institutional structures to support cultivators in rural Nagaland through the GEF-funded UNDP projects is commendable. Yet the ongoing economic and social transformation tells us something else. As part of my research between 2009 and 2011 in Nagaland and Assam, I documented experiences of cultivators from rural Nagaland who sold their produce at the weekly markets. The Naga cultivators, majority of who were women, were insecure about the future. Stories of failed crops, poor harvests due to hybrid seeds were common, as were the challenges to negotiate the pressure exerted by the state to introduce large-scale agriculture. The cultivators who were absent at the UNDP pickle workshop I described earlier in the paper are pressed today to become revenue-generating sources and take up cash crop farming that is market-friendly. This requires, among other things, the privatization of land. We must reconsider developmental and livelihood frameworks that shift the complex task of achieving global sustainability and biodiversity on the shoulders of the poor. It is naive to pigeonhole the experiences of cultivators as a one-dimensional story of tilling the land. Agriculture is only one of the many things people do with land, and that is true in Nagaland as well. Even as cultivation is becoming increasingly an unviable option, cultivators continue to nurse the desire to own and have access to land. Therefore, the ongoing transformation in a small state like Nagaland call our attention to larger global issues like the politics of land distribution, alienation, ownership, and land as an important redistributive resource. Several insights emerge from the conversations with women-headed households engaged in subsistence cultivation. In the 3 districts where the UNDP project is underway right now, a resource conflict has been brewing since the ceasefire in 1997. Cultivators are increasingly losing their land to extractive companies like coal and timber and to businesses that are establishing tea and rubber plantations. In order to address the prevailing situation of social groups in post-conflict societies, new theoretical and conceptual tools, along with new ways to engage with issues of social justice and rights, might have to be deployed. We have to be cautious of livelihood programs that seek to train subsistence cultivators to become harbingers of biodiversity and managers of ecosystem without grasping the existing social and political transformation on the ground. In Northeast India, the state's rhetoric of development and progress is fundamentally flawed. Policymakers shift the onus of change on marginal farmers, leaving them with alternatives that has nothing to do with farming and land. Rural households are discouraging the next generation of family members to become farmers. Instead, youths are motivated to become technicians, beauticians, or migrant workers. Thousands of billboards across Northeast India invite youths to join the hospitality training institutes that have come up across the region. If you scratch the surface of these training institutes, they are nothing but labor recruitment agencies. I just conclude with 2 paragraphs. After the 1997 ceasefire in Nagaland, the political spatial geographies of post-conflict zones have been reconfigured. Development is driven by a market-based, profit-oriented technique of government that seeks to produce citizens who are peace-loving, incentive-driven, and rational enough to solve their own problems. I shared the ethnographic piece about a pickle-making workshop in a Naga village with absentee cultivators and officials chasing to meet a deadline because such events, I believe, are lens that allows us to identify the challenges between visions of development and livelihood and the social realities on the ground. As I conclude, it is important to mention how the ceasefire in Nagaland has ushered numerous development programs without taking into account several issues that require urgent attention. Among the most important ones are the absence of rehabilitation programs for armed combatants residing in civilian areas, mechanisms to address rising cases of violence among families that belong to hostile armed groups, lack of psychological and trauma counseling centers, the absence of truth and reconciliation forums, and the omission of public consultation and dialogues on developmental and livelihood projects. How can we begin to grapple with the paradoxical idea that post-conflict societies require economic intervention and a model of development that is market-driven but pro-poor at the same time? How can principles of empowering the marginalized and dispossessed be converted into a monetary value and confined towards profit-oriented scheme? I hope these 2 riddles will allow us to reflect on the ongoing transformations in post-conflict societies in this gathering. Thank you for your time.
Dolly, that kind of resonates with a number of things that have gone before in the previous sessions, as well as with my own interest in what used to be called those days and seems to have dropped off the development agenda, the whole issues of indigenous knowledge and people's knowledge. I think you also introduced a few more swear words into our vocabulary today. So now I think, hold your questions. I know you have many, but I think we will go through all the presentations, and then because there's a lot of overlap and a lot of different ideas that cross the presentation. So I think the next one will be by Nayana, and we come from India down to Sri Lanka, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you, Priyanthi. So I'm going to speak about an ongoing research study that I'm currently working on, which looks at the links between social protection provision and state legitimacy in the war-affected northern and eastern provinces of Sri Lanka. Broadly, what the study aimed to do is to explore this link by looking at how war-affected people's perceptions of the state are framed through the ways in which they access and use social protection programs. To give you a little bit of background, the study falls under a strand of work in the Secure Livelihoods Research Consortium, or SLRC, which focuses on internal state building processes. The study hypothesizes that different groups of war-affected men and women will have different experiences of displacement and resettlement, which will affect the way they access state programs, and which in turn will then impact on the way they perceive the state. We started with a literature review to understand the current state of knowledge on the provision of social protection programs and the role it plays in state building and state legitimacy in post-war contexts. The received wisdom in post-war context is that social protection can contribute to peace building and stability by being instrumental in strengthening social cohesion and building state capacity and legitimacy. However, there is no empirical evidence to suggest that delivering social protection per se will impact on processes of legitimization and state building. This is because state-society relationships are likely to be highly context-specific, determined by the wider drivers of state building and state legitimacy, the nature of program delivery modalities, and by the way in which programs and services are delivered. Okay. So we wanted to engage with this theoretical assumption by exploring and providing some insights on the nature of the link and also factors which which shape people's perceptions. We also wanted to build on the 2012 SLRC Sri Lanka quantitative study, which indicated that the Sri Lankan state provided some basic level services in the conflict areas throughout the war, but that there were some variations in the way people access and use the programs. So based on the hypothesis that state delivery of social protection programs can contribute to state legitimacy in the aftermath of a protracted conflict, we came up with a few basic research questions, which focused on identifying the programs which were being delivered by the state and accessed by people, identifying how they were delivered by the state and how they were accessed by people, and then to look at differences in the way programs are delivered by the state. Is the process different in different geographical locations? Is it delivered differently to different groups? And here we wanted to pick up specifically any differences by gender or ethnicity. Likewise, we also wanted to find out if there were differences in the way people accessed and used programs. Was it different by geographical location? Was it different by gender or ethnicity? We also wanted to find out if there were variations in the way programs were delivered and how these variations affect experiences of accessing and using programs, and to understand how everyday experiences of accessing and using programs shape people's perceptions of the state. The literature suggests many ways in which state legitimacy can be obtained. As we wanted to explore the link between social protection and state legitimacy, we drew on the concept of performance legitimacy. Performance legitimacy is widely used in conflict-affected contexts, and how it works is that citizens assess the state based on its perceived effectiveness in delivering key services. So the assumption is that if people believe that the state is performing effectively in providing goods and services and implementing policy, then legitimacy can be built. So how did we analyze state provision of programs? We used the analytical framework which was developed by ODI for the SLRC program as a basic framework. There were three levels of the analysis, which was a macro level analysis, meso, and the micro. The macro looked at came from the literature review to understand the various concepts and definitions and to understand state-society relationships through a socio-political lens, and the role social protection might play in relation to other drivers of state legitimacy. The data for the meso and the micro levels came from the fieldwork The meso-level analysis takes into account contextual factors, specifically the political function of program delivery. So we looked at the presence and visibility of the state as a provider of state programs, the existence of standard administrative procedures for all programs, for citizens, and instruments for settling disputes and for creating political loyalty. Then we also looked at variations across different geographies and locations. The micro-level analysis investigates local experiences of program delivery and how program delivery plays out in shaping people's perceptions of the state. So here we looked at the visibility of the state in providing programs, then we looked at issues of accountability and fairness, and issues of inclusion and accountability, as well as capacities for local level, collective action and collaboration. Then we finally looked at also variations across geographic locations and groups. As the literature indicates, that correlation analysis in quantitative research has not been able to account for the causal processes through which service delivery affects citizens' perceptions of the state. We use qualitative research tools, which included 60 interviews at the household level using open-ended questionnaires to probe experiences and perceptions of programs and benefits. And we also did 30 key person interviews with officials in the provincial and divisional levels, which were undertaken to understand the process of administering programs and to obtain insights on the values and beliefs that underpin programs. Then the data was triangulated with officials at the village level. So for consistency in the sample, we went back to the same fisher communities in Jaffna, Mana, and Trincomalee districts, which had been interviewed in the 2012 quantitative study. 2 divisional secretariat divisions were surveyed in each district, which were further subdivided into village-level Grama Niladhari units. So 2 village-level units were selected from each divisional secretariat, and the sample was purposely selected to include male and female respondents from all 3 ethnic communities, Muslim, Tamil, and Sinhala. The social protection programs selected were the largest in terms of public expenditure and geographic coverage, and included Samurdhi, which is a means-tested poverty reduction program, state pensions, which is a retirement benefit for all state employees, the public assistance monthly scheme, a financial assistance scheme for those living in extreme poverty. Recipients are mostly single women and the elderly. The elders allowance is an allowance given to people over 60, poor people over 60, which is rupees 1,000 per month. The disability allowance is a monthly allowance of rupees 3,000. Child support in the form of scholarships and assistance in cash and kind available to poor children. So what did we find? What we found can be broadly categorized under 3 headings, and I will elaborate on each of them in the coming slide. The first is that a number of factors influence perceptions about the state, and not all of them are related to social protection. We found it very difficult to isolate social protection or to assess its role as a driver of state legitimacy. This is not to say that social protection is not important, but that it sits amongst a wide range of services that people expect from the state. The second point is that perceptions are influenced by expectations, and expectations vary and change. We found the variations in expectations among the different geographic locations quite interesting. For example, communities in Mana had less expectations from the state than communities in Trinco. In Mana, people were happy that now they had access to programs such as the Samurdhi and the disability allowance, which they did not have during the war. Although they cited incidents of favoritism in beneficiary selection, they were willing to overlook it, as they were happy that they were now receiving some benefits. In contrast, in Trincomalee, which came under government control much earlier, issues of bias and lack of transparency in beneficiary selection, in the Samurdhi program in particular, were often cited as issues for dissatisfaction. The third point is that the link between social protection and state legitimacy is inherently complex in a Sri Lankan context. And I say this because there's a strong belief that it is a duty of the state to provide for its citizens, and that provision of programs and services is regarded as a right of citizenship. So this notion was articulated by both state officials who provided services and also by citizens who are the recipients. So we looked at different factors which influence people's perceptions of the state. First, we looked at social protection programs. Then we looked at other factors which also influence people's perceptions which were not related to social protection. And finally, we looked at the role of non-state actors and if and how they impact on perceptions of the state. So we looked particularly at the NGO community, family, and the community at large. What were people's perceptions about state social protection programs? The state was very visible as a provider of programs. This visibility and penetration of the state as a provider was seen across all geographic locations amongst all ethnic communities. For many communities, the face of the state was a local Grama Niladhari, who is a public official appointed by the central government to carry out administrative duties at the village level. So it is a GN who informs people of the different programs available, nominates them for different programs, and submits a name list to the divisional secretariat. It is to the GN that villagers go with their complaints and grievances, and it is he or she who takes them up with the relevant subject officers at the divisional secretariat. Issues of discrimination and favoritism in beneficiary selection was cited particularly in the Samurdhi program. This was noted across geographies, and in some cases, ethnic biases were cited, particularly when the official concern was of a different ethnic group to the applicant. However, if a program had standardized procedures and the process of beneficiary selection, program implementation was transparent, the program was more likely to be perceived as fair. A case in example is the state pension program, which had very clearly laid down procedures which were implemented with regard to eligibility, benefit quantum, and disbursement. There's also the notion that it is a duty of the state to provide for its citizens. I spoke about this very briefly before, but would like to share a quote to illustrate this point. As a male pension recipient in Trincomalee said, quote, "The state should provide for its citizens because in developing countries, people need help, not like in developed countries. People in developing countries are poor and need help to live," unquote. How do program experiences influence perceptions about the state? Here we categorize the responses into 4. Some said they were satisfied both with the program and the state that provided them. These were mainly recipients of the Elders Allowance and the Public Assistance Monthly Scheme, who were either women or the elderly. Although the monetary value of the benefits was relatively small, recipients were happy because the money gave them some financial independence. They were grateful to the state who recognized them as being vulnerable and provided them with some relief. There was a second category who was satisfied with the program but not with the state that delivered them. These people had no major problems with the programs per se, but they had other issues with the state, such as non-implementation of the trilingual policy. For example, when an official correspondence was in Sinhala and the recipient was Tamil speaking, they complained they were unable to read and respond to the communication. Then there was a third category, those who were dissatisfied with the program and with the state. This category were those who saw the local official as a face of the state, and their issues with the state largely arose from their interactions with the officials. These people accused local level officials of nepotism, as being rude, of not addressing complaints, and fearing reprisal if they raised concerns. The local official was a face of the state, and the issues with the official were being interpreted as issues with the state. The last category were those who believed that the central government had good intentions, but it was the local level officials who were incompetent and inefficient in discharging their duties. Then we looked at other factors which were not related to social protection, but still influenced people's perceptions of the state. Some people said they were satisfied with the state because the war had ended. There was peace now, and they could move around within and outside of the district. Others said they were dissatisfied due to non-implementation of the 3-language policy. They also said that the state was not providing what the people wanted. And these were listed as livelihood support, housing, and jobs. Yet others responded they were dissatisfied with what they were getting and how much they were getting. So there was some dissatisfaction due to the mismatch between what the state was providing and what the people needed, which framed their perceptions of the state. We also looked at the role of non-state actors and the impact they have on people's perception of the state. There was no evidence to suggest that the NGO and INGO community were undermining the role of the state. At the time of fieldwork between September and November last year, many NGOs had withdrawn or had scaled back activities, prompting one respondent to say, "NGOs come and go, but the state is here to stay." The church and the mosque are providing some financial and non-financial support to communities in particular locations in the form of fishing equipment and guidance on where to seek support, specifically with regard to accessing child welfare benefits. The immediate family, children and siblings mainly, were providing considerable support to family members in need of help. Support came in the form of payment of utility bills, food and medical supplies, which supplemented gaps in state-sponsored programs. So what does it tell us about the link between social protection and state legitimacy? A thread that ran through the analysis is that state provision of services, including social protection, is a right of citizenship. As I stated before, this notion was expressed not only by citizens, but also by officials who deliver programs. A preliminary explanation, and I say this with a little bit of caution, could be Sri Lanka's long history of social welfare provision, particularly in health and education, which was provided even during the war. Sri Lanka also has a long history of programs to address poverty reduction. So people have gotten accustomed to receiving benefits from the state and consider these benefits as rights. Another factor is that people don't necessarily differentiate how they define social protection and social welfare. The study defines social protection drawing on the literature, which was from a safety net perspective, means tested and time bound, which is not how it is perceived by the surveyed communities, who see it more from a universalistic entitlement perspective. So expectations of what and how the state should provide stem from this more universalistic view. As a result, there are great expectations from the state. Not all of them are matched. So to conclude, many factors influence perceptions about the state, which include security, language rights, livelihood opportunities, personal dignity, respect, and social welfare provision. In Sri Lanka, it is difficult to isolate social protection as a driver of legitimacy or to quantify its contribution for many reasons. One of which is that the government of Sri Lanka had functioning institutions even during the height of the war, which provided some services and programs to communities affected by war. In this respect, perhaps Sri Lanka is an outlier on the received wisdom that social protection per se can contribute to peace building and stability. Thank you.
Thank you, Nayana. You raised some very interesting questions, which I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion on. So now we bring Rachel back to the stage to talk about the work in South Sudan.
Hello, again. Raise your hand if you think I spoke too quickly last time.
You did.
Oh, good, great, thank you. I'm pleasantly surprised. So as mentioned, I wear several hats. I'm taking off my Uganda hat and putting on my South Sudan hat now. I work as a researcher for both projects. And in South Sudan, things have gone a little bit differently for us than they have in Uganda. In terms of the research that we were able to carry out from the beginning, and obviously in terms of the ongoing stability of the country itself, and being able to label it post-conflict. Although, I'll jump ahead to my conclusion and tell you that I think South Sudan has never really been post-conflict. But now I'll go back to how we're going to get there. So in South Sudan, we were not able to carry out the large-scale survey that the other SLRC countries are doing because of costs and logistical challenges and all sorts of things that come up. But we were lucky in that the UN Food and Agriculture Organization was planning to do a similar survey in similar locations around the same time as we would have liked to do one. So we ended up just sort of jumping on their survey and adding some more SLRC-focused questions. The good part about that is that it means that there's some survey data in South Sudan, which there's not a lot of data that comes out, especially from outside of Juba and sort of the center of the country. The unfortunate side is that it means our findings are not at all comparable with other SLRC surveys, and it was tremendously difficult to carry out that survey and get much good data from it. But we did try to do that. That was in April and May of 2012, and then we followed up with qualitative fieldwork in February 2013 in the east and northern Jonglei state, and then went back in November 2013, and we were planning on doing more fieldwork in the southern part of Jonglei state, but ended up actually interviewing a different population. So I don't know if you can see this map very well. So we went to here. What's highlighted in red there is Jonglei State. where we were in, as I said, in early 2013 and then again in late 2013. In 2 counties the first time, 1 county the second time. We organized in early 2013 what felt like quite the expedition, because we had 2 vehicles and drivers and all of our food and fuel for like 2.5 weeks. We had 4 researchers and 4 translators, and we drove up from Juba through Boertown, which is the capital of the state, but is actually right in the southwest corner. Everyone thought we were crazy to drive there because the roads are kind of non-existent. But I'm focusing on this partly because I want to just note that these findings that I'm going to tell you about are very particular to Jonglei. And I think that to some extent they can be generalized to the rest of South Sudan, but in some ways they also can't because the situation in different states is very different. So they're sort of illustrative of the bigger picture, but I don't want to give you the impression that what I'm saying is about all of South Sudan all the time. It's really just more particular to where we were able to go. So to give you the headlines, as you can see, our key finding is that the biggest concern absolutely everybody had throughout 2013 when we talked to them was security. The security situation in all of the country, but particularly in Jonglei, was very complex in 2013, and certainly even more so today. Also, I should mention that this really is focused on pre-December 2013. Marika did a great job of covering what's happened since last December yesterday, but we're really talking about when we were there. But by far, the number one demand that people had in terms of the service they wanted the state or someone to provide was security. So I'll just highlight a few of our findings from each area. Now, their demand for security is not to say that other services were really available or that things were going particularly well. The situation in Jonglei in 2013 was really pretty dismal on all counts in terms of services. Access was severely limited, both because there are almost no services for them to access, but also because getting to any services is incredibly difficult. So livelihoods at that time were under very severe stress. For nearly everyone, the central livelihood activity is livestock ownership, cattle ownership, which has implications for food, milk, economic status, also social status, and ability to marry. So it's very important that people own cattle. But what we've seen is that in the past few years, livestock ownership has actually decreased rather dramatically. And we found this in both our survey data as well as our qualitative work. So now, according to the survey, over 50% of the population in our survey area reports owning no cattle at all. I should also say that in a few cases, people told us that they owned absolutely no cattle, and they used to have 100 cattle and now they have 0. And this was a fairly common response when we talked to people in our qualitative work. And we do have a little bit of skepticism because there's a lot actually of a history of people coming in, especially white people, being perceived as being from aid agencies that are doing needs assessments that might result in people being given the things that they report that they need. So there were a few times when we dug a little deeper and found out that people owned a few more cattle than they reported. But there's no doubt from all of the information we gathered and others that we've talked to who've been working in the area for a long time that livestock ownership really has decreased quite a lot. Most of the people that we talked to in northern Jonglei are very hopeful to get their cattle back eventually, although many people saw no option for doing that other than waiting until they could marry off a daughter, because then they would get bride price, which is enumerated in cattle. So I would have these conversations with people where they would say, yes, well, I'll get more cattle when my daughter can marry, and the daughter in question would be like a 2-year-old bouncing on someone's knee, which has implications, of course, in terms of pressure for daughters to marry. And I think in some parts of the country, you're seeing now daughters being married off much, much younger because families need to replace that livelihood asset. So we found severely constrained livelihoods and severe food insecurity in northern Jonglei. The big F word, famine, is now heard a lot in regard to South Sudan. And there's no doubt that the situation now is very much an emergency. But it is important to note that we found a hunger crisis in Jonglei State in 2013. And I think it was true to a certain extent across a lot of the country. And you had malnutrition rates that were at levels that under a lot of other circumstances would have been declared an emergency already. I'm not sure why in Jonglei last year they were not gaining that kind of attention, but the malnutrition rates were very, very high. The other conditions that we found there, as I mentioned, there's almost no infrastructure, with the possible exception of boreholes for water, which did exist in many communities, although a lot of them were broken, and they didn't know if anyone would come back to fix them or who should come back to fix them. There's severe insecurity, as I mentioned, with cattle raids and also rebel group attacks from one particular group that was still operating in that area at the time, who ironically, this is a militia led by a man named David Yao Yao, and he actually signed an agreement with the government of South Sudan, after the bigger conflict restarted. So I want to stress the issue of security because, as I said, that's what everybody really wanted to talk to us about. And I think that this is interesting because this is not really on the list, right, of basic services that I think DFID wants us to be looking at. But people definitely thought of it as a service and a responsibility of the government, and really it was the most fundamental aspect that was missing in their lives and keeping them from being able to recover their livelihoods, is what they told us. And as I mentioned, we heard so much about insecurity and cattle raiding in northern Jonglei that we actually decided to shift our research focus, because originally we were going to stay in that part of the country and then go north from there where the survey had been done. But everyone in northern Jonglei told us that the cattle raiding was coming from the southern part of the state, primarily from the Merle ethnic group that lives in one county called Pibor County in southern Jonglei. And they said people in the north told us that there used to be cattle raiding from other groups. And it is important to say, because we hear so much about this idea of ethnic divisions that are really problematic now, there's also a lot of intra-group conflict and intra-group raiding. So we were speaking to the Nuer, people from the Nuer ethnic group in northern Jonglei, and different clans within the Nuer definitely have, at least in the past, raided each other. There have been a number of conflicts. But in this case, people told us that the problems were coming from the Merle, and so we decided to go to southern Jonglei to get kind of the other side of the story. And in many ways, the other side of the story was actually the same story, which is fairly common, right? People say, we've been marginalized, we have less access than other groups, we don't attack anyone, we just defend ourselves. And in reality, especially in South Sudan, unless you belong to the very, very elite, it's fair to think, in this case, that you've been left behind a little bit. Now that said, Pibor County in southern Jonglei really has been left behind probably more than a lot of other places. There is almost nothing there, and the livelihoods pressure is tremendous. The infrastructure is basically zero, especially outside of the one of Pibor town, the capital of that state. So, as I mentioned, we were actually interviewing displaced persons from Pibor who were in Juba in 2013, and this is important in two ways. Even though the picture, number one, is even though the picture that they gave us of conditions in Pibor were, to us, really quite bad, almost everyone we talked to actually said it wasn't so bad, because they were really, we think that they were just anxious to return home, and they were feeling kind of nostalgic for what they'd been left behind. So they said, in Pibor things were fine, but it's in Juba that we're having a really hard time. Also, the reason that they were in Juba in November in the first place was repeated cycles of violence that have been taking place in Pibor County, which got really bad in the summer of 2013, but had been problematic for a long time before that. And that violence was actually carried out by a combination of their neighbors to the north and some other areas, but also by state security forces, who essentially, there were soldiers who rampaged through Pibor in 2013, not for the first time, and forced nearly the entire population to flee either into the bush, across the border, or to Juba. And the population we were talking to in Juba actually was probably somewhat better off than people from the rest of the state, because they were close enough to a way to get to Juba that indicates that they were in slightly better position to begin with, which probably just meant that they lived in Pibor town instead of living very far out. So the sources of insecurity in that area last year were numerous. Disarmament has been an issue. There have been various disarmament campaigns that have taken place across South Sudan since the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005. Nearly all of them have been not totally effective. They've been violent. They've sown a lot of seeds of trouble. I don't know if you can see this picture very well. It's a big pile of guns, which I didn't take this picture, but I think it's really interesting because I found two different captions for it. I just found it on the internet. It is from South Sudan. And one caption of this picture said that it was guns that were collected during a disarmament campaign. And another caption said that it was a gun market in Juba where people could go and buy guns. And we did hear some stories that, yes, there had been disarmament, but then people could go to the capital and just buy their guns back. There's no doubt that there are a tremendous number of small arms in South Sudan right now, and more coming in. So that's definitely one source of insecurity, and also the perceptions around who has guns and who doesn't. So we heard a lot in northern Jonglei about, we gave up all of our guns during disarmament, but the Merle have not been disarmed, and we don't know why, and we don't know why the government can't just go and disarm them completely so that we'll be safer. So that sort of marginalization narrative and unfairness narrative comes in there as well. Also, state security forces have been a source of insecurity in Jonglei. Intergroup conflict, as I mentioned, intra-group dynamics, and also historical grievances. So there are these cycles of revenge that go back, in some cases, and for generations that play into all of this. And aid money can't solve this problem, right? The paradox is that the more aid money has gone to South Sudan, the more money has been funneled away to pay off potential and now actual spoilers of peace. Because it's created, to a certain extent, market incentives to be a spoiler. Because the more you might cause problems, the higher the price of keeping you from causing problems. And so these issues, these have been present since 2005. The CPA, around that time, people were definitely aware of them. A lot of people were flagging them, but the CPA didn't really do anything to resolve them. All these problems have carried on through independence, both in spite of and because of aid money coming in, and also in spite of and because of the government. So the key question that I think is interesting to ask here is, when was South Sudan really at peace? Parts of it were certainly peaceful in the post-independence period in the 1950s, and parts were peaceful between the First and Second Civil War, so sort of 1972 to 1983. Parts were peaceful after the CPA in 2005, and parts of it are actually are peaceful now, but parts of it have not actually ever been at peace. If this were a smaller room, if this were more of a discussion, I would ask you where you think when you think this photo is from, but I'll just tell you. I took this photo in February 2013 in northern Jonglei, and this is what's called a rub haul. I don't know why. That's left over from Operation Lifeline Sudan from the late 80s through the 1990s. It's a World Food Program relief supply storage facility. It may be full of relief today, I don't know. It was empty at the time that I took the photo. And I didn't actually realize that this woman was walking by when I took the photo, and we didn't have a chance to talk to her, but I imagine that if we had talked to her, she would have told us about being insecure and being hungry, even though that was at a time of supposed peace. But she would have probably had the same message that she might have had 20 years ago and that she might have if we talked to her today. That's my conjecture. So I think that what this means is that we really need to revamp our understanding of post-conflict, as so many people here have said. I suggest that we think instead on what I would call a conflict continuum, that countries and parts of countries may find themselves to be on, be they in the middle of conflict, immediately post-war, relatively peaceful, such as northern Uganda, as I talked about, or as someone mentioned here on day one, even my country, the United States, there's actually an important conflict happening in one part of the country right now in Ferguson, Missouri, right, between citizens and the state. So there's this very wide range within the conflict continuum that locations can be placed on. And I think if we employ this framework, we actually have to start thinking of other related issues here on this continuum as well. So Lakhdar Brahimi said in 2007, "We know only too well that conflict is the antithesis of development." right? But the question I would like to pose is, what if that's not true? This line gets drawn, and I think we get caught up in this need to demarcate very clearly between war and peace and conflict and post-conflict, or relief and development, in ways that are actually distracting us from figuring out how to deal really effectively with this very messy reality at hand, and which is that a conflict, a context like South Sudan really can experience all of these conditions at once, conflict and post-conflict, the need for relief, the need for development. And that's been happening in South Sudan for over 50 years. And I would argue that the need for the conflict continuum sort of framing is especially true given, as some have mentioned here, rising chronic violence, urban violence, sexual and gender-based violence. These make conflict and peace really that much harder to declare, because whose peace are we experiencing? Do we get to count peace inside the home, or do we just talk about peace outside the home? But if we include all of those spaces where conflict can happen, then it becomes much more complicated. And of course, this is very complicated because there's certainly a negative relationship between conflict and development, not least in that money that is spent on fighting the war, at least in theory, could be spent on providing services. South Sudan just made a huge weapons purchase from China for $15 million at the same time that 4 million people are in serious need of assistance in the country, and 1.3 million people are displaced. But I think what you have is a situation where donors are spending so much time trying to figure out exactly what the right model is and exactly what underlies legitimacy so that they can work it into programming plans, when in reality, I don't think that there is ever going to be a really clear answer to those questions. To give you a metaphorical example of this that I hope will work, you probably know, many of us have had the experience of learning a second language or a third or a fourth language. So you know that feeling of being really excited about your vocabulary and you're crafting whole sentences in your head that you're very excited to say in conversation, and you're getting ready to say them. And then by the time you're ready to say that, the conversation has moved 10 minutes down the road. Right, and I think to a certain extent this is what happened in South Sudan last year. The international community, broadly speaking, to lump them all together, was kind of still standing there at the end of 2013, conjugating its verbs for a conversation about stability and development that had completely ended, if in fact it had ever been the correct conversation to have. So that's why I think the current situation has caught many people really badly by surprise, even though the warning signs were all there. Just going to finish quickly. So what those warnings suggested accurately, and what our findings from Jonglei really bear out, is that really the entire history of South Sudan, whether you date it back 3 years or 9 years or 59 years, can be said to be a history of conflict. And that's certainly true, if not for everyone all the time, then for a lot of people much of the time. There's never really been a time that they haven't been conflict affected. And I think that we do the South Sudanese a disservice by suggesting that conflict is the opposite of development and that no development can take place during conflict, because it dishonors the very hard work that people are doing and their very serious needs. So the question that comes to is what does it mean for the concepts of peace building and state building if peace and legitimacy are really much more slippery concepts than we often treat them as? Number one, I think that donors have to ask themselves really difficult questions and engage in much more complicated situations. The donors really wouldn't touch a lot of the transitional justice or reconciliation processes, the various kinds of them, or different donors wanted to do it different ways, and it was really complicated. So that really, this is easy for me to say, right? That we need to do that a lot better. But I think that donors need to be able to and willing to engage with much more complex realities. And people really need to focus on providing security as the basis for people being able to rebuild their livelihoods. And unfortunately, in South Sudan, we have the opportunity right now to see what happens with an obvious return to conflict, which seems to be ready to drag out for a while. But even there, it would be a really bad idea for donors to pull out of the peaceful part of the country, which is happening now. There are parts that are at peace, even though they're also receiving IDPs. But the idea is that the emergency aid is needed elsewhere. So you see this line being drawn really sharply again between conflict and peace. Perhaps because, as Marika said yesterday, it's easier for donors to wrap their heads around these very sort of clear ideas of emergency relief needs. But I think we really need to resist that binary, because otherwise there's really a danger of actually creating a more dire situation for a lot of the country than the war itself is creating. Thank you. Oh, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention, you've seen this a couple times already, please check out our website. We have lots of publications and papers and briefing notes and such that are on there for all of the SLRC countries, and we invite you to join our listserv, follow us on Twitter if you do that, and see what else we're coming out with, because we're very much in the middle of this research right now and hope to be taking it in some more interesting directions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I had sort of some ideas floating around in my head, and I think Rachel somehow managed to chase them out with this very interesting and very impassioned almost last summary of what is actually happening in South Sudan, and this whole idea of conflict and development, which I think is really raises some really important questions for all of us. But I'm also very happy that the speakers and the presentations actually brought in from a more micro level, some engaged with some of the questions we had been talking about at a macro level as well, on the whole sort of growth and market-driven development and that paradigm and how it translates at the micro level, the role of the state and the importance of providing security, the challenges of program delivery, and also quite clearly I think I did miss some plenary sessions, but in most of them we hardly talked about the differences between people, men and women, ethnic groups, so I think that was also brought up. I'm going to propose that if you have any direct questions to any of the specific speakers, we ask them first, and that then it's now 11:15, we started 15 minutes late, so I propose we stop at about 11:05, 11:10, rather than at 11 sharp. So if you have any specific questions to any of the speakers first, please ask them first, and then we can move on to a general discussion. The floor is open.
My question is to Nayana. I just wanted to clarify something. So you had selected 3 districts in the north and Trincomalee in the east. And you said 2 villages in each DS division, right? So I was wondering whether if it was a random sample, or did you select those who were on social security programs already? And if so, did you talk to people who were not on the different social sectors, particularly Samurdhi? That was one question. And related to that, because the areas you did the research in also has the history of the conflict and multiple displacements. So coming from my experience also is that one thing that happens with the displacement and moving to different places is that it's very difficult to get back onto Samurdhi and social welfare schemes in the place you are. So I was wondering how, especially in Mana possibly, because Trinco would have been earlier, how the displacement impacted on family, it's seen household access to Samurdhi, and particularly the new families, like their difficulties, and if you were struck off, were you able to get back on onto the schemes? And just the last point you made, as social welfare being seen as universal and social protection as means tested and time bound, if you could clarify what you meant by that.
Okay, thank you. Nayana's formulating the answer to that. We'll take a few more specific questions. Dr. Luca. Sorry, Dr. Luca.
Yeah, thanks. I think my question to the panelists, the 4 case studies, I just want to think beyond critique and to see what is really working and to build upon. And specifically, I want to ask the 4 cases, the role of traditional institutions. Because it came out, I think, yesterday, and I want to see to what level that if the traditional institutions are working, are becoming mediating becoming a bridge between the provider of the services and the people. What are we seeing? What is coming out? And I could see clearly from the case of India, but indeed even Uganda, because I think we have lumped them together. But even in Sri Lanka, we put them as family and community. But I think it would be very important to look at the issue of the traditional institutions, because these are where we could see that why we need to focus on these institutions.
Thank you. We can take one more specific question if there is.
Yeah, my question is also to Nayana. I think your sample included areas which were previously under...
Sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I'm just asking whether the sample included areas which were previously under the control of the LTTE, because I guess it is also a paradox that, and how you explored this issue of state legitimacy then, because it is a fact that throughout the war, even in areas that were controlled by the LTT, the state continued to provide certain welfare measures to the people in those areas. And then post-war, to what extent the perceptions are also gendered, because you said, I think, people still see the DS as the face of the state, but in a context of militarization, has that changed to some extent? And how is that gendered also?
Okay, thank you. If there are any specific questions, I think Vijay has one here and David. Okay, then hold that. If that's a specific question, Vijay, yeah?
Thank you. I do have a question for Nayana as well, but it's slightly different from the others. One of the senses I got, the sense I got from looking at you, reading your paper and also listening to you, was that somehow the fact that people think it is their right to to access benefits from the state seems to be a problem. Somewhere, and then you speak about the confusion between social protection and social welfare, that people are confused between the two. Actually, I don't understand why they should be clear. I mean, why should they? I mean, there are certain expert discourses that construct social protection, social welfare in certain ways. But when you speak about that confusion, that relates to the fact that people have this idea that they have a right. This is a right. I suggest that actually the problem is not that. The problem is with that framework, because that framework has no place for rights. That framework that you used, in my view, is problematic because that framework assumes one kind of relationship between citizens and state. It does not have, and this is the point that Dolly was making, it does not account for the social and political histories that prevail. So then you can't fit, where people actually think that they have a right, you can't fit it into that framework. Because that is, I think that's a problem with that framework itself. And in some ways, the continued use of that framework underlines a problem, just like Dolly was underlining with her presentation, that despite all the rhetoric about rights-based and so on and so forth, actually what we have pickled and preserved is a slightly different approach.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are any specific questions, just to remind you that we can also ask your questions in Sinhala and Tamil if you wanted to. Okay, let's take that round of questions first, and then we will go on to some more general questions. So I think it's Nayana's in the hot seat, so let's respond.
Okay, so there were 3 questions, I think, from the lady over there. About the sample, yes, it was purposely selected. So what we did was, in each village, we selected about 3/4 of the sample were people who are already getting social protection programs. Some were, we purposely selected people who got some of the elders allowance, disability, and then we also looked at one or two others. Then we also talked to people who were not currently receiving, but we found most of them had actually applied, and they were awaiting sort of a decision. And most of them, some of them also said that they had received a decision and it was no, and they were uncomfortable with that. Also with some of the recipients that had already got, I mean, I went on the field myself and I could see, for instance, if they got one allowance, say they got samurdhi, although they were disabled, they were not entitled to get disability. And the disability allowance is actually more than the samurdhi allowance they were getting. So they had some issues with, why am I not getting this and why am I getting that, and what I'm getting now is less than what I should be getting as a disability allowance. So there were some issues. So you also asked a question about whether people access social protection programs before the end of the war. In Mana, the villages that we went in Mana, for instance, were in LTT-controlled areas right up to 2009. They did not receive any social protection programs as such, but they are being rolled out now, as in 2012 to 2013 when the survey was done. We found that people were being targeted and were getting some benefits in Mana in particular. Trincomalee and Jaffna, they'd been getting benefits for some time. Then you wanted also a clarification on the safety net and universal approach, and then also I want to tie that with what Vijay said. So when I was reading through the literature, there were we define social protection looking at the safety net aspect, which is basically that it is means tested, it's time bound, and it's also this idea that it's a cushioning, that not everyone is entitled to it, but if there is a vulnerability, people are likely to fall into poverty, already in poverty, it's a way to push people up from poverty. So that is the definition that I took for social protection, because we felt that health and education were more covered under basic services, and even under the SLRC program, health and education were looked at from a basic services perspective. So we left those two out. But coming back to Vijay's question, yes, I mean, it's the whole issue of, of it being a right is something that I found that came out of the study. It was not something that I'd kind of, looked at before. And then I went back and I was sort of questioning myself as to, why is this? And then went back to the literature, looked at this kind of history of social welfare provision, and then tried to sort of come up with some ideas about where is this coming from. So I think, yeah, you are right. I mean, we come with these kinds of frameworks, and then we find that not all that we find out from the grassroots level really fits into, these frameworks. So.
The frameworks have to be modified. Chulani asked a question about whether your sample included people in the LTT areas.
Yes. In Jaffna, in Mana, we had groups that we went to fisher communities that had been under LTT-controlled areas. When I talked about the face of the state, it was the Gramanidara, GN, who was the face. So a lot of even the women said that he's the one, because they did say they did not know very much about what the government was doing, but they relied on the GN to come and tell them, and he did. In most cases, they were quite happy with the fact that he was coming to the house, he was talking to them and telling them what programs are available, putting their names on, and if there were any delays in receiving benefits also, it is the GN that they went to kind of get some redress from it.
Okay, thank you. We had a question from Luca. I don't know whether you want to say something.
I think that this question was for everybody, but I'll take a first stab at it. So the question was around both the role of traditional institutions and also positive examples and how we can support those. And I think there's a double-edged sword, especially on supporting what's happening in positive ways, because as I mentioned with Uganda, there has been this policy focus on supporting the more viable households, right? And there's an argument to be made there that, do what's working and support those households or communities that are doing better, but on the other hand, that leaves more vulnerable communities and households and groups behind. On the flip side, in South Sudan, what we see is the aid right now going to the places where the emergency is most severe and completely taken away from the areas that are more peaceful. And I think we have to do both or all of the above. I mean, it's a really easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to do. But I think that, especially if we think of a lot of this in terms of rights, that people have basic rights to at least, water, sanitation, healthcare, things like that, then those rights need to be provided for both where people already have some of them and where they don't. And in South Sudan in particular, I think that there are some more interesting ways in because of the traditional institutions. I'm not quite sure what you mean by those, but I'm thinking like chiefs and other leaders, the church maybe, in different areas. And I think however services and can be delivered and those rights can be supported, I think it needs to be done. I don't have an easy, clear answer on how it should be done, but basically bringing as many parties to the table as possible to figure it out would be a really good first step.
Yeah. It's not. Dr. Luca, thank you for your question. And like many communities across the Himalayas, the Nagas are also an oral community. And since the conflict started during the time of decolonization in 1947, what the counterinsurgency measures did was to actually break apart the traditional institutions, which was very central to keep communities together. The first process that happened was actually to enforce traditional institutions to become informers and to become spies so that they could work with the security. During the time of ceasefire, the state has done every bit it can to make them an appendix of the state. And that has been to try to codify them, try to standardize them across districts, across provinces, which are very different, I think, tribe-wise. And by codifying and standardizing, what it has done has to actually, in some way, maintain that women are excluded. Women, children, widows are excluded from these traditional institutions. But I still feel that it is important to support and also to fight for these traditional institutions, because during this entire process of militarization, which has been for more than half a century, if there is something that has kept communities together and kept communities sane, is actually these institutions, no matter how broken and battered they are. And today, especially in the process of peace and reconciliation, not only within communities, but inter-ethnic, it is these traditional institutions that come into play, and the languages they have about peace and reconciliation is extremely important. And the last point that I want to emphasize is that the government of Nagaland brought out the 2012 Natural Resources Act, which gives no right to traditional institutions to customary laws, because within the Nagas, land is community owned. And as such, even as we talk now, it is the traditional institutions in the grassroots which are leading the protest and the mobilization to make sure that land remains with the people and does not become a state property where resources, and like our friend from Burma described yesterday, becomes a state property so that the timber companies and the natural resources such as oil and hydrocarbons are taken away. Because this region that I talk about is part of the Assam, Arakan, Yoma belt in the eastern Himalayas, which is one of the oldest oil-producing regions of the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a round for maybe about 2 or 3 questions more. So, David, you had a question, and then Aisha.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So it's kind of a general question and a specific question because I want everybody to answer. And Dolly started, I was going to say, what was the what was the old mode of production? How was land owned or managed? So you've answered that in a way, but you know, conflict produces development. It produces new classes. It produces new state forms. I mean, this is what we're seeing here in vivid color. Except, I would ask the other questions, and of course the donors don't want to ask you these sorts of questions. Who are the new rich? What are the new class formations that are benefiting from this? How are new configurations of state, multiple state, people thinking like a state, which is NGOs and donors, how are they arising out of this situation? I think Ma'am Danny got kicked out of Uganda way back, I think in the 70s, when he was talking about how the famine produced a lot of wealthy capital entrepreneurs. What modes of ownership and wealth are being transformed into this, what I think Berend in Uganda called the new war mode of production, right? So, new forms of state and new ideas about people's rights, which are coming out of these new situations. So new forms of state and class accumulation, and new forms of rights that can create some sort of communities of resistance and how they use. Okay, sorry.
I think Aisha behind you.
Yeah. Just taking on from Vijay's comment about, you know, if protection, social welfare is a right. I mean, that connects with a larger issue of reactions towards people's reactions towards in a post-colonial state. I mean, their reactions to a post-colonial state are probably the same as towards a colonial state. So, which means basically that while state is not your own, it doesn't belong to you in certain respects. Definitely, you know, the behavior of the state is such, but you also expect it to give you, you know, what you think of in terms of rights. Now, my question to Nayana is that, you know, I was looking as I was listening to your presentation, the one question which comes to mind is that between what the state expects and what the state wants to do and what the people expect from it, there's also an element of wastage of resources. Wastage of resources it takes very many forms. And in public sector, when it comes to social protection, social welfare, there is a lot of wastage of resources. I didn't hear anything about it. Dolly, one question to you is that, you know, wonderful presentation. I just, you know, on the sideline I'd ask you what to do with, you know, how to make pickles. But, you know, that we could do later. See, the donors, when you look at donors, their perception of, there's a difference between how indigenous societies think and how donors think. And one wonders that, you know, I'm sure this presentation, this is not the first time that people like you have presented. Now, where is the gap? I mean, donors, the problem with donors is their methodology. They count in terms of numbers. They count the deliverables. Anything which is quantifiable, that's fine. Otherwise, they move on. Now, where do you think, from the perspective of Nagaland, where is that communication? I mean, do you see the donor understanding the needs of the indigenous community? Do you see a bridge anywhere?
Thank you. Doesn't look like there are many other pressing. Okay, just one quick one. And then we have to give it the panel to respond.
Anand Galap. It's really a quick question, Rachel. You spoke about the sort of long-lasting effects on people's health.
Can you hold the microphone closer?
The microphone just isn't work. Is it? Yep. Okay. You have to bite into it. Okay. Anand Galap. My question is, Rachel, about you spoke about the long-lasting health, physical and mental health consequences of
Again, you need to close the, hold the mic.
To get close. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There's an art to this. We see them said compartmentalization of resources for health provisioning and for mental health care, for psychosocial support and so on, which are often seen as very distinct from those for economic reconstruction, infrastructure development and so on. Is there anything coming out of the work in Uganda that may help to connect those two in terms of being able to make a case for the fact that physical and mental health impacts also relate to the ability of households to recover in terms of livelihoods and so on?
Thank you very much. I will start with Dolly and go this way so that we are panelists. We only have about 5 minutes so, for all of us. So just respond to all those questions in however way you feel you want to.
David, thank you for your questions. And if you're asking me about all modes of production, I think, let me talk about spaces of capital in this region that I'm referring to. And this is where I think that we should re-examine this very idea of spaces of capital, because the distinction between that we have of pre-capitalist societies and centers of capital is disrupted, you see, because of the tea plantations and the oil explorations that are going on. So we have very primitive and savage societies, but at the center of it, you have this world capital trade that happens. So when I go around the world and I tell people where I'm from, they don't get it, but when I say Assam tea, they do get it. So it's also this commodity, this disjuncture that we have, that we understand, and we get the commodity, we eat it, we drink it, and yet in some way, the social reality and the spaces that humans occupy is erased. And the second question that you asked me about who are the new elites, I think I can take that question a step backwards and say that since the 1990s, especially since we're talking about India here, in 1993, the government of India came up with the Human Rights Protection Act. And after that, the state human rights commissions across India were established. And this is where I'm saying that human rights is no longer a people or, let's say, an activist objective. It became a state subject in the 1990s in India. And when I say that the new elites and really the rich in these conflict areas, not only in India but across the world, are those families and I think individuals and groups who are managing the conflict, they do very well understand the language of rights. And that's why I feel that we really, really have to engage with a little bit more seriously and deeply. We just can't say human rights and get away with it. And coming to Aisha, thank you for your comments. And I think when you asked me about donor and how societies think about donors and how donors operate, and where is the communication? Is there any kind of communication, and what is a bridge? I think I have a lot of friends who are, who work in funding agencies. And often when we talk about the communication that we have is just a friendly communication because they work like the Catholic Church, like the Vatican. They work through their consultants. They write the surveys, they do the projects, and if you look at this kind of conflict areas like Northeast India, these regional conflict areas, where do the consultants come from? That's your homework, my friends, do it. Do they come from Calcutta? Do they come from Bangalore? They fly overnight, they complain about the roads with no historical, social, basis. It's like, I'll tell you, it's like directors and scriptwriters flying into LA and just doing like 12 hours of meetings, drinking 20 cups of coffee. And I get friends in Assam and in Nagaland who say that consultants call them and say, we are on our way to the airport. Can you meet us beside the highway, outside the airport coffee, so that I need to talk to you. I need to get the data. And my friends, that's the reality. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to say something? I have you can have
On David's question about new political elites, I think I would suggest that you go also to my colleagues.
Can't hear. Try this.
colleague's presentation, I think, which is happening in one of the parallel sessions, which is coming up, where he talks about the resurgence of caste, particularly in the north, and how that is playing out in the whole sort of socioeconomic structures that are now emerging in the north in particular. So Aftab Lal, I think he's in one of the sessions later, so you might find something interesting there. On Aisha's question about state resources and about wastage, I think there's a genuine attempt by the state to allocate a lot of research for the northern and eastern provinces. It's a sort of catch up for the northern eastern states now to catch up with the rest of the country. But at the same time, I don't know this whole issue of wastage, because in the fieldwork that I found, and also looking at some of the literature that has come out of social protection targeting, there are issues of wastage in a sense, that there's a lot of people who are on these lists who should not actually be on them. So there's a lot of political interference, there's a favoritism that goes on. So sometimes there is wastage in the sense that people who should be on the list are not getting what they wanted, and there are other people who are getting what they don't really need. So perhaps there are incidences of wastage, but there's no particular study that has been done on that.
Thank you. Can I give you the last word?
Yeah. I'll just respond really quickly to the question about how you make the case for the impacts of war on households now. And I think really the answer is you have to have the data. And as I mentioned, the survey that we did in northern Uganda was actually different and added. It was different only in that it added this one section on people's experiences of serious crimes during the war. And that is the piece that has given us so much great data to be able to make the connections to how households are doing now. And I hesitate to say this a little bit because I think that donors and so many people are very caught up right now in the need for data in terms of numbers and quantifiable things and on all sides of it, right? You know, what's coming in and also value for money going out. But it's just absolutely key to have the data from things like the surveys and the qualitative work to fill in the gaps in the surveys to really know what's going on with people. And I think then using that data to go to government policy, to go to aid donor policies and say, look, we're not just making this up, but there's a lot of good language. There are a number of countries here that we're talking about that have the best laws in the world. They're just not enforced at all to do what they're intended to do. But if you have the data and you have the familiarity with the legal framework where you are, then you can say, listen, we have the data that shows this, and your law says that we need to be providing specialized treatment, be providing reparations, whatever it is. So now that has to happen, and then it's a advocacy issue, which doesn't make it easy, but if you have the numbers to go in there and the knowledge of the laws, then you're in a much stronger position.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much to the panelists. You're 15 minutes into your tea, which I'm really sorry about. The next panels will start around 11:30. So please find your space. Do you want me to tell them what they are again? Once again,